Hello everyone, this is Mr. Laubach. I hope you are doing well. In this video, we are going to discuss the concept of due process. Now, this is also covered in the textbook in Chapter 8, pages 355 to 358, so only a couple of pages of the textbook. So first of all, what is due process? Due process is the legal requirement that the government must respect all legal rights that are owed to a person. So keep in mind that this does not necessarily mean that person must be a citizen of the United States, but they may even be visiting and just here in the United States, depending on the situation. The two amendments most closely associated with due process would be the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. The Fifth Amendment states that life, liberty, and property cannot be taken away from an individual unless they are given due process. Now, there are other things that are addressed in the Fifth Amendment, but that is it directly related to due process. And the 14th Amendment states that all of the rights of citizens not only applies to the federal government, but also applies to local and state governments. So in other words, local and state governments must recognize due process as well. The idea of limited government is also an important thing in terms of due process. The framers wanted the government to be as small and not infringe on people's rights as much as possible. So due process protects us from our government and requires the government to treat everybody fairly. Now, there are two types of due process. There's substantive due process. This guarantees that the laws themselves must be fair. So a law must be constitutional or it must be fair, meaning the law itself. The second type of due process is procedural due process. This guarantees that the laws will be enforced in a fair and equal manner. So not just the law must be fair, but how it is applied to an individual must also be fair and follow due process. So according to the constitutions, and the framers wanted it this way, the states have police powers. So what exactly are police powers? They are promoting health, safety, morals, and the general welfare. So basically, states' role is to oversee the well-being of their residents. Now, these powers are not absolute, and there are federal guidelines for each of these powers in these examples that I'm giving you, but these are the four main types of police powers. So to promote health, states can limit the sale of alcoholic beverages and tobacco and make laws to combat pollution and require vaccinations. Number two, to promote safety, states can regulate firearms, require the use of seatbelts, and punish drunk drivers. Number three, to promote morals, states can regulate gambling and alcohol, and we could throw the legalization of recreational marijuana in here. They can regulate the sale of obscene materials and the practice of prostitution. And number four is kind of the catch-all. States can promote the general welfare. States can enact education laws, provide help to the medically needy, and limit the profits of public utilities. Now, all of these powers are not absolute by the state government. So as we look back at these four police powers, note that the federal government can set the minimum guidelines for these things in the spirit of the supremacy clause, where the federal government trumps state government. So as an example, a state is not allowed to ban firearms altogether because of the Second Amendment, but they are able to regulate firearms within the state. And different states have different drunk driving laws, of course. Different states have different measures for combating pollution and vaccination. Certain states have different rules on alcoholic beverages and tobacco. In terms of morals, certain states allow gambling. More states are doing that nowadays. And the sale of obscene materials and the practice of prostitution. Nevada is the only state that has legalized prostitution, and examples of promoting the general welfare. Education laws vary from state to state, and what the medically needy is able to get and has rights to, that varies from state to state as well. So now let's take a close look at the concept of eminent domain, which is spelled out in the Fifth Amendment. Now, when we think of the Fifth Amendment, we oftentimes will think of the rights of the accused, like pleading the Fifth, but eminent domain, the framers snuck it in there in the Fifth Amendment. So what is eminent domain? Eminent domain, simply put, is the taking of private property for public use. So if let's say, government of Lower Merion Township wanted your property, they are allowed to take it as long as they compensate you the fair market value. This is often referred to as the taking clause of the Constitution. The government must, however, give the owner of the property fair market value. Now, fair market value is the economic value. As we all know, Sometimes there is an emotional or a mental value to property, and that cannot be replaced. So there are many examples throughout history where the government wanted someone's property and they just did not want to give it, even though they were being offered a fair market value or even beyond the market value. A great example of the enforcement of eminent domain is in the building of the interstate highway system. So under Eisenhower, the interstate highway system was enacted, where now all across the country there were going to be interstate highways placed. Now, many of these highways went through people's private property, and the federal government used eminent domain to purchase this property from them. Now, this was, of course, a very controversial thing, but it's a great example of eminent domain. Not too far from us, 476, which we know as the Blue Route, back when it was being built many decades ago, it's called the Blue Route because there were various routes that were options. There was the red route, there was the green route, and there was the blue route. They obviously chose the blue route. The name has stuck. And then if you own property where the blue route went, the federal government paid you the fair market value of your property using eminent domain and took your property so it could build the blue route. Now, one last item when we're discussing eminent domain. The Supreme Court has recently ruled that public use can also mean for economic development. So instead of the government just taking private property to build a road or to build a school or some other government building, they can take it for the purpose of economic development that they supposedly say would help the greater good. A terrific example of this would be Kelo versus the City of New London in Connecticut in 2005, where the city came in and took an area which they deemed as blighted, purchased it from all of the owners, and then redeveloped it into a more attractive place for economic purposes. Now, the people of New London fought this, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did, in fact, rule that eminent domain can be used for economic improvement. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of controversy with this type of use of eminent domain.